Thanks all for coming. I'm going to introduce myself, tell you just a little bit about my company or the company that I work for, and then perhaps go back and kind of tell you how I got here and some of the challenges that I faced and the things that I learned. And I'm trying to think of it as advice that I might have given to my 20-year-old self, because I did a few things right and a few things wrong, and hopefully I can share some of that with you. And by all means, interrupt if you have questions. I guess the first question I have is, I mean, you're all interested in business, obviously, entrepreneurship. Is anybody interested in real estate as a career? Okay. So I'm a partner at TMG Partners. We're headquartered in San Francisco. It's a 35-year-old privately held investment and development company. And we operate just in the Bay Area, which is to say anything within driving distance of San Francisco, Silicon Valley, Oakland, and San Francisco itself. And what we develop, invest in and develop predominantly housing, which is we call multifamily apartments, office space, and thanks very much, Pat. And what we call R&D, research and development in Silicon Valley. And I will I got a few pictures. I didn't do slides, but I'll show you some pictures and pass these around of some examples of the projects that we do. This is we haven't broken ground on this. This is a site at Pier 70 on 3rd Street in San Francisco that we bought from the Port of San Francisco. We'll break ground next year. There'll be about 250 apartment units, actually condominiums, because it'll be for sale. One of the things about housing in San Francisco these days is it's very, very challenged for a few reasons that I'll give you. I heard today at a lunch that I'm sure you're all wrestling with housing costs. In the 60s in California, when it had a population of 15 million, the state was building approximately 250,000 housing units a year. Now, 60 years later, with a population of 40 million, we're only managing to build 75,000 units a year in the entire state. So we have this crunch of enormous, almost insatiable housing demand with with all the new jobs that are coming to California and the Bay Area, but a complete inability to develop new housing. And so in theory, that should be a very profitable business for us, because that's part of what we do. In practice, it's very difficult. And I might just put this back to you. Of all the challenges we face building housing, which is obviously in great demand, what would you guess is the biggest single challenge that we face? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
Dealing with the government?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. What's what we call entitlements. If you want to build this apartment building, we bought it entitled from the port, so we're going to break ground pretty quickly. Typically, if you buy raw land from the city, whether it's Berkeley, San Francisco, Marin, it can take you 5 to 10 years just to get it approved before you can put a shovel in the ground. So no wonder we have a housing crisis when we created 750,000 new jobs in the Bay Area in the last 7 or 8 years, and it takes us 5, 6, 7 years even to get a shovel in the ground, and then another 2 to 3 years to build it. The other problem we're facing is acute labor shortage. When there was a downturn in 2010, and there was a big sort of exodus from the construction industry, and those people just haven't come back. So there's a big labor shortage, which translates to high construction costs. And so the third thing is that the cities require us to build affordable units, and it costs us just as much, about $800,000 a unit, to build an affordable unit. But we can only rent it for a subsidized rent. So all those things combine to make life very difficult for us in terms of developing new housing. This is a smaller project. It's a 150,000 square foot office building at 4th and Brannan, next to Caltrain in San Francisco, that we developed a couple of years ago and leased to Pinterest, that you've probably heard of. This is a high rise that we haven't broken ground yet in Oakland, uptown Oakland, 19th Street, next to 19th Street Bar. It's a full city block, and that tower will be 800,000 square feet when it's complete. It's a large project, and we're looking for two things at the moment. First of all, the capital to build it, because it'll be about an $800 million project, and then a tenant, maybe in the opposite order, because the tenants are going to come out of San Francisco. There aren't enough big tenants in Oakland, but because San Francisco is so constrained, we're able to attract some of the bigger name tenants from San Francisco. And then finally, pass this one around. This is called Platform 16. That's 1 million square feet, a low-rise building, and it's right at Diridon Station, and adjacent to downtown San Jose. It's an example. Pretty much everything that we're doing today is adjacent to transit, because along with the housing crunch that we're all experiencing, the housing crunch has created a traffic problem, a traffic nightmare in Silicon Valley. And so we're trying, everything we do is adjacent to transit, even though we pay more for land, because people don't want to sit in their cars all day. So if people can go to work on the train or BART, the space that we build, whether it's housing or office space, will be more desirable. So that's a kind of TMG in a nutshell. Relatively small company with 35 people. We try and focus on bigger transactions, because there's an old kind of cliche in real estate that you spend just as much time on the small deals as you do on the big deals. So if you can do the bigger deals, you're better off, because the smaller deals can take as much time and effort and risk. I'll just chat for a few minutes about how I got here. You can probably tell that I'm from another country, the UK, and I graduated in 1975, and that was at a time of great sort of economic trouble in the UK. And I'm just going to address this. I've got some notes here. So I didn't make a conscious decision to leave, but I had a summer job picking tobacco in Canada, and when my second tobacco harvest was done and I graduated, there was very little to go back for. I mean, obviously I had family that I was close to, but career-wise there was nothing to do. There weren't the kind of opportunities that we have today. And so I kind of, after the tobacco harvest, I kind of drifted across to the western half of the country, Canada, to Calgary. And I was looking for a job in commercial real estate. I knew I didn't want to sell houses. And I found a company in the Yellow Pages. And I got myself a job interview on the phone, and I had a couple of hours to prepare for it. Problem being that I had hair down to here, and I was still wearing my, tobacco outfit, which is kind of jeans and dirty old shirt. So getting a haircut was easy enough. But I also had this sense, the one thing I knew about business was that, business people wore suits. So I went out to try and find a suit in a city that I didn't know anybody. It turned out the only thing I could rent was a tuxedo. So I duly rented the tuxedo and showed up for my job. Which I got the job for some strange reason. I ended up staying with this company for 11 years. But I think I'm glad I did that, because it obviously made some kind of an impression on my boss. And interestingly enough, he's he's now in his 80s, and he's still alive and kicking, and he still talks about that tuxedo. So there's through this, my kind of journey of the last 4 decades or so, there's a few things that I wanted to that I've been exposed to, and I wanted to chat about. One of them is risk. And I think that since this is a business class, and some of you at least are aspiring entrepreneurs, I think it's worth just chatting a bit about risk and the different types of risk. In our business of real estate, the risk, there's financial risk, there's what we call entitlement risk. You buy a site, can you ever get it approved when you get bogged down with the city? But also I think that there are ways to mitigate risk, and although we are in the commercial property business, we're in a very risky sector, we try and mitigate the risk as much as we can by doing due diligence before we make financial commitments. And I heard, I don't know if you know who Alex Honnold is, but he's the guy who climbed El Capitan. He did the movie Free Solo. And I heard him interviewed the other day, and he talked about how, that first climb, how lucky he was, but that he didn't want to be known or to think of himself as a lucky climber. He wanted to be thought of as the best climber there was. And so he spent the next few years kind of really taking the risk out of his what is essentially a very risky business. And that's kind of what we do. We spend a lot of time, first of all, for every deal we do, we probably look at 20 or 30 deals, and that's a lot of hard work. And then we do the research on what the entitlements are going to look like. Often it isn't, you mentioned the government, it's often not the government, it's more likely the neighborhood. Because the governments the city governments will tell you that they want to approve housing, but if the neighbors won't approve it, then it doesn't get built. So we do a lot of sort of preparatory work, getting the neighbors on side and kind of finding out with neighborhood meetings like this, what do you guys want to see on the site? You want a coffee shop? Do you want to go 8 stories or 10 stories? And sort of getting a dialogue between us and the neighborhood is very important. So it's one of the ways that we mitigate risk. I think another way to think about risk is to quote Rudyard Kipling, whose poem "If," one of the lines is, "If you can make a heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss." And I think that, it's very tempting to think that being an entrepreneur is risky, but there's risk in everything you do. And in fact, if you end up working for a large corporation on a salary, on the surface that would seem to be less risky, but in fact, if you get laid off at the age of 50 and your job has disappeared, then you're in a much riskier position. And I would argue that what you guys, those of you that go into business, you want to be thinking as quickly as you can about being self-employed and controlling your own destiny. Because the sooner you can do that, the more fun you're going to have. You may make and lose a fortune, but if ever there was a time to do that, it's when you're young. Because as you get older, you get to my age, you tend to be more risk averse. And so, if you, as Bob Dylan said, if you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. So why not take risks when you're young? Because you've got plenty of time to make it back. The other thing that I suppose I believe in a lot is travel. And we were just chatting about this beforehand with Larkin and Paddy. How many of you are from the Bay Area? So quite a lot. And the Bay Area is a tough place to leave. It's really, I certainly when I got here, the last thing I wanted to do was to leave. But as luck would have it, when I started my career in England and then Calgary and then Denver and San Francisco and then back to Calgary to Toronto, I lived in 6 or 7 cities by the time I was in my early 30s. And I was practicing then as a commercial real estate broker, which you can probably imagine is all about market knowledge and contacts, who you know. And so it seems antithetical that I would have moved so many times in such a short period of a decade. And the reason I did it is I was with a company that was moving me around, and I probably made less money by moving from market to market, but I think that getting to know those different cities gave me a sort of broader perspective on sort of life generally, and also on, by knowing 4 or 5 different real estate markets, I perhaps was able to understand this one just a little bit better. So to the extent that while you're young, you can travel, I would strongly encourage you to do that, and go get a job on the East Coast for a few years, and then by all means come back here. But travel really broadens your outlook, and it's great to have personal contacts in different parts of the country. The other thing is that I would say is whatever you decide to do, you need to become a specialist, and that's particularly true when you're young. And so, using real estate, which is the only example I know, you need to know a lot about a little as opposed to a little about a lot. So if you think about real estate, it's infinite. You've got buildings all over the Bay Area. If you're a broker or a developer, you can be scattered. But if you focus in on some specialized area of either the real estate business, in my case, or whatever business you're in, you need to become the go-to person for whatever your chosen area of specialty is. Because when you're starting out, you need a way of sort of distinguishing yourself, and learning something in a very specialized way is a way to do that. So when I started out in Calgary, instead of spreading out over the whole city, I drew a line around a map and focused on 10 or a dozen blocks and got to know that better than anybody, so that when there was something going on in that area, I would always know about it. And I became the local expert, which is very helpful to do when you're in your 20s, because you've got youth on your side, but you don't have experience on your side. The other thing that is important to focus on, and you're already doing this, but is your network. And networking doesn't happen by accident. You have to work at it. Bill Clinton, when he ran for president, he was famous for his friends of Bill, and it's said that he had, by the time he ran for president, he had 10,000 or so people in his Rolodex. It was before the iPhone, and he was able to call on those people. And I'm not suggesting that you should all run for president, but I just think that as you're rising up in an organization, you don't want to be the person that's crunching numbers in a back room. You want to be the person, or one of the people, who's out there cultivating their alums from Cal and their parents' friends, and just getting to know as many people as you can and keeping up with them. And that's particularly true if you're operating in different cities, because it's great to have a network in New York and a network in Boston and one in the Bay Area. So like I say, these things don't happen by accident. You have to work at it. It's sometimes uncomfortable. It's not that easy to pick up the phone and tell a total stranger that, you know, or maybe somebody from your alumni book that you just arrived in town and you wanted you to get coffee and ask for advice. But it's amazing how many times they'll say yes, and that's the start of your network. I want to read you something that related to this. You need to. This is an excerpt from a book that I'm reading. I'm going to put my glasses on. Samantha Power was Obama's ambassador to the United Nations. So she arrived in the White House, and she talks about how she was trying to find her way within that power structure, and you know, I think was a highly successful person, but there was a point at which she, hang on, okay, so I also came to appreciate one advantage I had. I played basketball. Soon after returning from maternity leave, she just had a baby, I joined regular games that took place at the Department of the Interior and on a court that Obama had refurbished just off the White House lawn. Playing pickup with other administration officials gave me relationships I could never have cultivated through regular office interactions. I not only competed and joked around with my male colleagues, but also cornered them to lobby for my latest cause. I finally understood why so many men played golf and the professional disadvantages that accrued to women and men who didn't. So what I'm getting at there is that as part of your networking, it's great to have some activity or activities that expose you to senior people in the community or within your organization. And one way of doing that in a community is philanthropy. Obviously, philanthropy is something that you should be thinking about anyway, even at your age. And philanthropy doesn't mean writing large checks. Nobody expects you to do that. But it can mean working for a philanthropic organization and getting onto a board and then fraternizing with senior people and also showing yourself as a, you know, as a meaningful member of the community. But it can be philanthropy, it can be sports, it can be networking breakfasts, it can be Chamber of Commerce, but it's really helpful to meet people outside the office environment at a social level or at a sporting level, so that once you establish a relationship, they're going to take your call. If you're trying to get through to someone that you've never met, it's a lot harder than if you're introduced to them by someone who plays basketball with you. I've talked a lot. Any questions? So moving on. I think the one thing you want to focus on as early as possible is becoming self-employed. Now there are different versions of being self-employed. I was, until I formed my own company, I was always working for a larger organization. But as a broker, essentially, you have to go out every morning and look for a job because you don't get a salary. You're gonna have to look for a buyer, look for a seller, look for a building, look for a tenant. And so I would encourage you to think about starting your own business as soon as you've had enough experience. And generally, people will work for a large company to gain that experience, but always be looking for opportunities to do your own thing, because it's a lot more fun and you won't necessarily make more money, but you'll be independent. The other thing about entrepreneurship is the need to be flexible. Keynes said, "When my information changes, I alter my conclusions. What do you do, sir?" So by that he meant that you can have a great business plan, but if the world around you changes, you better be nimble enough to do something about it, because you don't want to end up following the Chinese river dolphin into oblivion. So be focused, but at the same time be flexible, because the world around you is changing the whole time. And you know, right now we're finding it increasingly difficult to build office space in San Francisco because there's a annual limit on the amount of space that can be delivered. And so we're kind of starting to take the same sites and building what we call life science or biotech space, because there's no annual limit on that. So we're always looking at our business plan with a view to changing, because the market's very dynamic. The other thing has really helped me is reading. Obviously you guys read a lot, but I think that when you're out there talking to people who inevitably are older and more experienced than you, one way that you can give yourself an edge is to be well informed. And reading can take many forms, but the kind of reading that I like in the business world are things like The Economist or the Financial Times, which calls itself the hometown newspaper of the rootless cosmopolitan elite. It's sort of a, you know, it's an international newspaper, but I started reading it because it has a great arts and culture section on weekends, and I found that I was reading that and then reading it every day. But you need to be, when you're communicating with people that are older and more experienced than yourself, it's a big advantage to be able to talk about whatever's going on in the world, whether it's politics or the economy or China or war in Syria. And just being well informed is going to help you enormously, even though it might have nothing to do with the business that you're pursuing. Those are kind of some things that I've learned over the years, and be happy to answer a few questions if you want to explore that. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the talk.
That's all.
What you mentioned that you recommended we should start in a big company before moving out to work independently. What benchmarks should we look for before we go out on our own? Like, do you have any tips for knowing when it's appropriate to do so?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think that the reason that I would start with a big company is because they have years of experience, and they have structures, and they have discipline, and you will learn a lot, even if you don't particularly enjoy what you do. But I like, if you pick the right company, you can have both, the learning and the enjoyment. It's hard to know when is the right time. I mean, some people will wait till they're 50 and start their company. Others, as you know, in the Bay Area is famous for 23-year-old billionaires. I think it's really according to how quickly you want to be on your own, and what's your access to capital is like, and do you have a great idea. I mean, we're in a culture and environment right now, particularly with the education you're getting here, that it's entirely normal for 23 or 25-year-old to start their own business. But I wouldn't be rushing into it, because I would, the more you learn with your larger company, the more likely you are to be successful. So I think that question is really, it's about the individual and the idea and the capital and how comfortable you are with risk, not just financial risk, but putting yourself out there, getting outside your comfort zone.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Pat.
So it sounds like you've been in commercial real estate essentially your entire career.
Yeah.
How did you know that that was the thing you wanted to do, or when did you decide that that was the thing you wanted to do the rest of your career?
Yeah, good question. So I actually, when I was applying for college, I wanted to do law. I mean, I was a typical high school kid. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but law seemed like kind of interesting. And I applied for 3 or 4 colleges to study law, but I didn't get the right grades. And there was a course in London that I had applied for estate management, and estate management was a kind of English word for real estate. So the answer to your question is I stumbled into it. But it's also true that, I grew up on a farm, and although we certainly didn't grow up in poverty by any means, there wasn't a lot of spare money around. And by the time I got to college, I don't mind admitting that making money was something that was a high priority for me. And so I knew enough to know that real estate is a very lucrative business, or can be. You're dealing with big numbers. So I kind of stumbled into it as a college course, and through that class, a lot of the other kids on the class were from real estate families, and so I got into the whole milieu of real estate and money. The only problem is I didn't have any money, and England was in deep recession, and so I decided to look further afield. But it's like a lot of things. I didn't start out with a big plan, but once I got into it, I realized that it checked a lot of the boxes that I was interested in, which is to say, my first boss used to say, real estate is about land, bricks, mortar, and people. It's very much a people business, but it's also, you're dealing with a tangible asset. You're not shuffling papers, you're not just dealing with numbers, you're actually dealing with bricks and mortar. And so by definition, you're not tied to a desk. You're walking buildings, you're showing buildings, you're buying and selling buildings, you're improving them, and physically improving them. So it's a combination of the tangibility of the asset, an asset you can really touch and feel, whereas banking, law, it's all about words and numbers. Real estate is about something tangible. And then the people aspect of it, which I've always enjoyed, and not being tied to a desk. So it has a lot to recommend it, in addition to the fact that if you look at most of the seriously wealthy families in this country, a big proportion of them come from real estate. So if money is an issue with you, and it doesn't have to be, I mean, I realize I'm on the Berkeley campus, maybe money is a dirty word, but if money is of interest to you, real estate is a very assured way of getting there. And the sort of pathway in my case, since I had no capital to start with, the brokerage business is a fee generation business. And so in the commercial sector, you're dealing with big assets, and so the fees are a lot bigger than selling houses. So that's a plus. But one of the decisions, the tangible decisions that I made was that I didn't want to be a 65-year-old broker, because I know quite a few of those. And the thing about brokerage is it's a little bit of a trap, which is you make really good money, but you pay a lot of taxes, and you live high off the hog, and you get trapped in this business because there's really no other industry where you can make that much money, so you can't get out, because nobody likes to take a drop in pay. So I made a conscious decision maybe 20 plus years ago that I wanted to be a principal, which is to say an owner as opposed to a broker. And so I developed a relationship with TMG, which is my current place of employment, and they became my biggest client, and then eventually they became my only client. Every time I found a deal, I took it to them, and they were very loyal in return. And then this was when I had my own company, and when I sold the company, they said, look, you sold your company, why don't you join us? And so that's when I joined them. So that's not the only path to get into the development ownership business, but it's the path I took, and it worked for me. Yeah, sure.
Can you talk more about your takeaways from traveling and living in different cities?
Yeah, the reason I traveled initially was I was traveling away from a deep recession. There were no opportunities, and so I was able to emigrate to Canada and eventually United States. After that, I was with a company, a Canadian company that was expanding into the US, and I actually opened offices for them in Denver and San Francisco. So they offered me that opportunity. And the point that I was trying to make earlier is that by doing that, I definitely made financial sacrifices, because you're in a city for 2 years, you're building up your network of contacts, you're figuring out the market, you're getting known in the community, and suddenly you have to get up and leave. And so in the short term, I was making financial sacrifices. In the long term, I was able to develop a network actually in multiple cities that was very useful to me. So I think the best way of saying it is that by being offered these opportunities by my then employer, I was getting outside my comfort zone, and I was having to go back to ground zero again and again, and it forced me to build the network yet again from scratch, and it was very hard work, but it paid dividends, and it also got me into this mode of picking up the phone is kind of easy, and so I'd say that it's over time has been one of my strengths. And I think that I have 3 kids that are your age more or less, and I've encouraged them all to go to school on the other coast, because I think that school is a great opportunity for them to get out of the Bay Area and see another part of the country. One of them's living in London now, one of them's in New York, one of them's in Boston. I just think when you're in your 20s and 30s, and before you get married and before you have kids and other responsibilities, get out and see different parts of the world, because the Bay Area is not going anywhere, it'll always be here. But you'll be much better equipped to come back and succeed if you have that broader perspective of living in different parts of the world, or even different parts of the country. So I really can't stress that enough, that it's a great thing to do. Sorry, oh yeah, go ahead.
Can you talk more about building your business and the decision to sell it?
Yes, so the business was Stubbs. That's my name and my business partner. We started it in 1988 as we called it a sort of boutique brokerage firm in downtown San Francisco. And boutique means we had, max 15 to 20 people. And it was a completely different time than today. This is right now we're in a very prosperous time in the business. And, you know, young people in their 20s are making millions, but back then there was no growth in San Francisco. In fact, there was a net loss of tenants. The big corporations were all moving out to San Ramon and Pleasanton because they wanted to be close to where their employees lived. So the market was shrinking. It was it was just a tough way to make a living. And the only way we could compete was by taking business away from other people. And so we made ourselves somewhat unpopular because of that. But we would call on building owners, you know, office building owners where the building wasn't leasing, and say, hey, give us a shot. Your building's been vacant for 3 years, and we'll go out and lease it for you. And we were very aggressive getting the assignments, the leasing assignments, and then equally aggressive in filling the buildings. And I don't know if it happens as much today, but it was essentially about cold calling, you know, going to the top of the building, knocking on doors, getting in front of tenants, finding out if their lease was expiring, and then showing them the opportunity. So it was a tough business, but it was, and back then, honestly, not that lucrative. It was a living. It wasn't a great living. What it was, though, was a great sort of foundation in understanding how the business worked. And I guess that if I had any other sort of gratuitous advice, it would be starting out in some kind of sales position is a really great place to start. Sales, because we're all bombarded the whole time by salespeople, it tends to get a bad name, and in many cases justifiably so. But pursuing sales yourself, it's a wonderful way to learn humility, and learning humility at an early age is a very good thing to do. So back to your question, we built the business, and it was successful. We were making money, not huge amounts of money, but enough. And Grubb & Ellis, which is now, was then a publicly traded real estate brokerage company. They had offices all over the country. They had a very weak office in San Francisco, and they approached us and said, we'd like to buy your company, and that's going to involve you, the principals, the three of us, staying, you know, on a 2-year contract. Essentially, they were buying us. So we sold the company, put some money in our pockets, and then became absorbed by this larger organization, Grubb & Ellis. And it was at that time when I started having conversations with TMG, which is, you know, the development company that I now work for. So that's kind of how it unfolded.
Was it a tough decision to sell the company?
It was very tough, and oddly enough, I say there were 3 of us. I was kind of a holdout. I didn't want to sell because I didn't really like this this suitor, this company, Grubb & Ellis. I thought we could, it's not so much we could get more money, that we could end up with a better organization. So by holding out and by being a reluctant seller, we were able to force them to pay us a little bit more money. So that was a good thing. But it also was a turning point for me personally, because there was no way I was going to stay with this company for very long. So I worked off my 2-year contract, and then transitioned over into the development business, which is where I am today. So I'm with the same company now, 21 years later. So it was a vital turning point for me. Also, as a sort of, as luck would have it, I took the capital that I had been able to take from the sale of the company, and I bought 2 office buildings on the North Waterfront, which I still own today. And again, that was 20 years ago. They were cheap. They were both owned by Levi Strauss. They're adjacent to the Levi Strauss headquarters, and they were using for storing furniture. So I was able to buy those 2 buildings with a couple of friends and convert them from warehouse to office use. through the city planning process. And so we converted them, improved them, leased them, and we've been, we've held those buildings ever since. So these are sort of things that you don't plan, they just kind of happen, but I think the idea is to stay alert to opportunities. I've made my share of mistakes as well. What else? Talking?
Speaking of mistakes, were there any risks that you took on specific projects that didn't pan out, and how did you recover?
Yeah, so I remember one particular little building that we bought at the end, so 1999, 2000, we had a thing called the, you guys wouldn't be old enough to remember it, but it was the .com, it was the first tech boom in San Francisco. And there was a huge run-up in prices and rents and values. And we tied up a little building on the waterfront, and this was with TMG, of which I was a partner. But we went, Matt and I went to our group of partners and said, look, we really like this deal. We want to put in the lion's share of the capital into this deal. Which was quite a lot of our own capital. And the other partner said, sure, if you want to do that, that's fine. And as it turned out, we were right at the very top of the market. We didn't know that. You never do know when you're at the top. And so right after we closed on this building, the leasing market suddenly just went away. And it does that. And so we lost all of our capital, and it was a valuable lesson. And I'm thinking of that today actually, because right now in this very heady period in the real estate cycle, where prices are at an all-time high, demand for office space from Google and Apple and LinkedIn and Facebook is infinite, and it's been going on for 9 years, and I can't help feeling that we're getting close to the end. Now, I may be quite wrong, and you know, we're in this phase now where if you stop buying too early, you watch all your competitors make a fortune for the next 5 years. But if you stay in too long, you lose money. And what we're doing right now to sort of mitigate our risk is by bringing in more equity and less debt. So equity is ownership, debt is when you pay the bank, feed the bank every month. So we're trying to put more and more equity, institutional equity, into our deals, so if there's a downturn, we can hold it through the downturn and wait till the next cycle. One of the things that the Bay Area is, and its tech fueled economy is noted for, is that while the cycles, the downturns can be very sharp, very steep, the recovery period is usually pretty quick. So it's kind of the cycle looks like that. You go to markets like Chicago or the Midwest, and things just bump along for decades. But we're in this tech-fueled economy, which is extremely volatile in a good way. So as long as you can hold on through the downturn with large amounts of equity, wait for things to recover, we'll probably be okay. So that's kind of how we're seeing things. Looks like it's 6 o'clock.